Am I being abused? It's a question that no one wants to consider. It's really hard to think that someone you love might be capable of hurting you. But abuse is way more common than you think. And I'm glad you're listening to this podcast because domestic violence is not always easy to identify. I'm MC Robinson, and this is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. In this episode, I'm speaking with JBWS's housing navigator, Danny Meza, to cover the basics of domestic violence. We explore the signs of abuse, common abusive tactics, and answer a lot of frequently asked questions. Some of those questions include, is it abuse if it's only happened a few times? Could I have caused the abuse? Can they be a good parent to our children, but still be abusing me? Is it abuse even if they've never hit me? Can men experience domestic violence? And so much more. But before we get to this episode, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsilenced wherever you get your podcasts, because it helps us to break the silence around domestic violence. So, when it comes to domestic violence, I think there can sometimes be this sort of reluctance to believe that maybe you're being abused by someone who's supposed to love you. And, maybe somebody's listening to this podcast, they're coming to this, they see the title, and they're really wondering, is my relationship abusive or not? And like before we even start this conversation, just kind of curious what you would say to somebody right off the bat as they listen to this whole conversation about this warning signs of abuse.
So I think this came up with a client recently. It's not your typical quote unquote domestic violence where someone's beating you on a daily basis. It's more so psychological, emotional, financial. You don't need to be hit to be abused. It all comes from the base of respect, and without respect, true love can't be a thing, at least in my opinion.
I think that really goes to show you that there's like a fundamental misunderstanding sometimes of domestic violence and what abuse can be and look like. And I also feel a key part of this plays into a difficulty in trusting yourself and like your own sense of reality. Many people might have been told that they're crazy or that they're over exaggerating. How does that kind of play into abuse or maybe keeping somebody from recognizing what's actually happening?
I think this comes into like the isolation part of domestic abuse. If you
Mhm.
don't have a community, you really don't have anyone to be upfront and honest with you. And most of the people experiencing domestic violence lose their community, whether it be because they're in codependent relationships or because the person choosing harm decides that it's no longer in the other partner's best interest to have friends because of this, because someone might say or recognize, pick up on the signs.
Mhm.
So I think it all comes down to community. Having that, at least one person, at least it'll plant the seed in your head and you'll be able to sooner or later, hopefully sooner, realize that you're in a situation like this.
Yeah, and it also makes me think that if you're only getting one side of the story, one person's telling you, well, you're crazy, like you're overreacting to this. If you don't have that community, you don't have that support, you have no other lenses coming in to maybe offer a different perspective. Would you agree?
hmm Yeah, I definitely agree. Because sometimes the only people we can talk to is our family, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're our community. If you don't have that external community that is reminding you that you're not crazy, you're not overreacting, you're not making stuff up, this is simply how it is, then it's very different.
Absolutely. So we kind of covered some of these elements of abuse that might be present in a abusive relationship, but I think it might be helpful also if we talked more broadly about the warning signs of domestic violence, while also recognizing they could look really different for a lot of different people. But what are some of those signs that maybe abuse is happening?
Just based on like my personal experiences and what I've experienced with clients, I think the number one sign is the love bombing.
Mhm.
It's like it's a written rule somewhere in the book of domestic abuse. You're being love bombed, and then there's a sudden change. There's a shift an attitude toward the person because I think the person choosing harm gets so comfortable being around the other partner that they can just show themselves as they are. But then when you're out with community members or out in the public, they go back to this loving, caring, love bombing person, which confuses anyone. So coming to the conclusion of being able to speak with someone and saying, hey, do you think this is what's going on? I think it's hard in the beginning because of these sudden shifts in attitudes. I think another good example of domestic abuse early on is isolation. I think that's a huge part. And also, some people may be like, don't worry, I got you. I'll take care of your financial responsibilities. And again, you might think this is an act of selflessness and love, but it's so they can control you, and then the rest unfolds little by little, in my opinion.
How might they use that financial control of being like, "Oh, hun, don't worry. Like I got the bills. I'll take care of this. You don't need to like worry about this." How is financial abuse used to control somebody that's experiencing abuse?
They want to be in positions of power, the people choosing harm. So they want to take any power away from the other partner by making them rely on them, ask for and beg for money.
Right.
And money is just essential in the life of anyone, even of a little kid. You need lunch money. A teenager needs to buy their books. A mom needs money for gas, groceries, and a bunch of other things. So the fact that they're making them ask or giving them an allowance instead of paying them for their labor, because if they're stay-at-home parents,
Mhm.
that is labor in itself. So they should be receiving a paycheck just like they would in any other job. So it's not so shameful at the time of asking for money.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point because I think the statistics is something like in 99% of abusive relationships there's financial abuse, and that's so hard to overcome because if you have your credit ruined, if you're suddenly in debt, you have no access to money, how are you going to leave that relationship? So I think
Mhm.
that's a really good thing to bring up in this situation. I also, you mentioned isolation. That's obviously people think of isolation in the extreme. Oh, they don't let me talk to my family, like I'm just with them. But does isolation always start out like that, or is it more subtle? And what are those subtle forms of isolation that might be present at the beginning?
It, like you said, it doesn't always start out like that, like
Yeah.
point blank, you can't speak to anyone else other than me. It always doesn't start like that. But I think that some people do pick up on the signs of domestic abuse. So a friend might tell the non-abused partner, hey, I think something's going on in your relationship. And then, of course, you don't see it, so you share it with your partner. And I think that's where the partner start saying, well, if you're going to communicate with them, you should really keep to yourself what you're going to say, keep it at a minimal. And so the relationships become more superficial. And I think that's when you really start losing your community because you can't be 100% honest with them.
Yeah, yeah, that's such an interesting point. So, would you say it's more like sometimes it could look like, I don't really like your relationship with ex friend. Like I feel like they don't like me and they're bad for our relationship. Or like, I just feel threatened or insecure. And it's things that I feel like people might be able to tap into a little bit of like, okay, like I guess, but then like would you say it's kind of like a slippery slope after that?
Yes, it is because once your boundaries are down, then there's no boundaries to respect. And then, unfortunately, the other person will take advantage of that. So, for example, let's say I've been single for a while and I have a friend that I like to hang out with a lot.
Mhm.
If I'm in a relationship, I'm not going to have the same time for both my friend and my partner. And so the partner might cling on to the fact that, oh, you've already hung out so much time with your friend. You're already hanging out with them like 3 times a week. Why, if I'm here, your focus should be only on me. So, and then once you start giving in, then it's nothing. You can't be with the other person or other friend at any time.
Yeah, and it could feel good at first of like, oh, they want to hang out with me. Like, oh, that's so nice. And then it's where it starts to get into that kind of cycle. So, actually, I think before we get into some of the most frequently asked questions about abuse, I'm just going to take a little advertisement break. So, here's a really interesting question. In your work with people, because you work with people that are experiencing domestic violence a lot, what are some of the questions maybe that have come up when they're coming to terms with what's happening in their relationship? Is there like a theme or a strong theme that you see that you always kind of have to answer or educate them about? Like, something that they think, oh, I don't know, am I experiencing abuse? Because maybe it's only 10% of the time. Like they're not always terrible or something like that.
Yes, I think there's a theme in clients of all ages. The number one theme being, hey, I'm not being hit. Therefore, this can't be domestic abuse. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's another theme throughout all ages. They've only done it once or twice. They didn't really have a hard hand. They didn't choke me. They didn't give me a concussion. They didn't give me a black eye. So I said something and I feel like I deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
Is a common theme. People think they're the ones that are at fault for causing it
Yes.
when it's not true. Of course, it's
Mm-hmm.
not. When it comes to financial abuse, I think people have a hard time recognizing that they've lost, in a way, their power over finances.
Yeah.
So they have to get very sneaky in the ways they make money
Mhm.
in order to not have to beg.
Yeah. And you mentioned a lot of really good topics that I think we should kind of go into a little bit more. And so, one of them, what would you say to somebody that's like, can I be in an abusive relationship if it's only happened 3 times? Or, my partner's great to me, but occasionally they'll act in this way I don't recognize. They'll scream at me, yell at me, belittle me. Is that abusive?
That is abusive. Getting them to understand in one or two sessions isn't the easiest thing to do. I think it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
But thankfully, JBWS has so many amazing programs. So I was referred to the JCMV
Hmm.
and their programs because some partners are willing to take some type of accountability and recognize that they have low moments where they overreact and it turns into something really big and they do want the help. So when I have these conversations over the phone on helpline, I always recommend that they refer to the JCMV and enroll in the appropriate program. Through my housing navigation work, I did get a referral and I could see the impact of the program in this person and I could see how much they've grown
Mhm.
and that they're truly overcoming that abusive pattern in their life because of the programs we offer.
Yeah, and just for anybody listening, JC&B is our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, which is our abuse intervention programming for people who've caused harm to encourage behavior change and accountability. It's an amazing program and I love it. And I think it's really interesting because I do think there's a tendency for people who are experiencing abuse, that's only happened a couple times. Like, why do you think there's a reluctance to kind of see it as abusive if it's only a couple times?
I think it might come down to childhood. If you grew up being reprimanded
Mm.
with physical, like with physical assault, maybe not as bad as it is when you're an adult. I think you normalize that subconsciously. I
Mm.
also noticed that a lot in other cultures, especially the Hispanic culture. They don't recognize a lot of things as abuse. For example, being slapped, that's normal to them.
Mm.
So in one or two sessions, you trying to provide psychoeducation to this client, explaining what abuse is, it might not get through to them simply because this has been their whole entire life and it's been normalized, unfortunately.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's very important to kind of also call out that, it happening 1 or 2 times doesn't mean that it's always going to stay in such an infrequent consistency because a lot of times abuse will build. And so, yeah, maybe they exploded on you, 6 months ago and they haven't since, but they did last week. It could then increase in frequency, especially feel like that's just the nature of abuse. Is that like right?
Yes, which is why when a client comes into Most of our programs, I've worked at the Morris Family Justice Center in the shelter program. We do this thing called the danger assessment, and it can basically show people that based on their answers, it's only going the violence is only going to increase over time.
Wow.
So this is a great document for them to really see the type of danger they're subject to while being in an abusive relationship.
And I think also that being on paper of, hey, this is the risk. It's right here might be very impactful for people. So a couple of other frequently asked questions about abuse. One of them is it possible that I am causing the abuse to happen in my relationship? I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but am I responsible for what's happening? And if I could just please my partner and do everything right, would the abuse stop?
No. To answer your question, no. You may trigger the other person because you're human.
Mhm.
That is very normal and natural. And if there was a healthy space to communicate, each person in the relationship I'm sorry, in the relationship could communicate their triggers and try to avoid them. But truthfully, we're all going to make mistakes, and it comes down to how the other person reacts. They could say, hey, that really hurt me, walk away, cool down, and come back, instead of making it a 10, like 100, I would say, making the situation increase in severity.
Yeah. And I think this belief that, oh, I caused it is also almost people wanting to feel like, oh, if I caused it, like I can control it. That means I can stop it. And I think that that's just something that you can't do because I think it was Robin Hughes was on and she said something like, if I cooked chicken for my partner, I cooked it perfectly, it was amazing. They would say, oh, I wanted beef. Because it's like whatever the cause and effect, there is no cause and effect, right? Because domestic violence is about power and control. It's not triggered in response to actions, right? Because it's not an anger management problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely not. And I think back to what Robin shared. If they're going to get pissed at you, they're going to find anything. They're going to find dust on the floor. They're not going to like their chicken. They're not going to like the way it was served, the way the plate was put down. They're going to find a reason and take it out on you. And I think also the part of blaming yourself, and it does give you a certain point of control, or yes, I guess it gives you a certain amount of control where you can blame yourself instead of blaming the person you love so dearly.
Mm-hmm. It's almost easier, and
Hmm.
that's what gets really hard with recognizing abuse because there's, you don't want to, who wants to admit that that's happening, You don't want to even think that way of your partner. And I think you also said this earlier, but one main question people have is, could I really be experiencing abuse if my partner isn't hitting me? Because you have a lot of people out there that are like, well, I mean, they've never hit me. It's only been verbal. It's only been financial. Like, is that really enough to count as domestic violence? And what would you say to the people who feel that way?
Based on what I've experienced, what I've seen out in the world, other people share their stories over YouTube and TikTok. There was one particular person that really got me into this movement back in COVID, and she would always say, like, I'd rather get hit 100 times out of 100 than be subject to the emotional and psychological abuse because I'm belittled to a point where I think my humanity is worth nothing and I shouldn't be in this world. Whereas from a bruise, I'll recover, I'll find a way. But the things that are staying in my mind are staying with me forever. And it's just another way that trauma works. So, to answer your question, no, you don't have to be hit to be. And I hope you're not never hit, you're never abused, but it's not as simple as just being touched.
That was an amazing answer, and I think that that's really insightful and something that a lot of people need to hear. The next frequently asked question people have is, can my partner be a good parent to our children and still be abusing me?
Yes. And that happens a lot. Like before I came into this field, my idea was that if you're bad to the mother of your child, you're going to be bad to your kids.
Hmm.
Somehow, I guess all people do have a level of empathy. Some people's empathy only goes as far as to their own blood and children. But again, they need a punching bag. Thankfully, they're not going to take it out on the kids, but they will take it out on their partner. There is a great percentage of parents that do decide to be good to their kids, but then they use other tactics of abuse to get back at their partner through their children. So I guess one could argue that are they doing it in good faith? No. Like, for example, parental alienation, where they just talk so badly about the other parent that the kids never want to go back if they're at that age.
Yeah, and what are some other ways that people might use their children to kind of inflict abuse or harm onto their former partner or current partner?
Um, Other than parental alienation, I think one of the most common things is that they'll talk so bad about the parent
Mm.
that when the kid goes back to the parent when they're mistreating them, using bad words toward the other parent, they lose respect for them, they don't listen to them, and unfortunately they start mimicking the behaviors that they see in the other parent, where they can become abusive. I remember I took a social studies class, a social work class in college, and we went over like the cycle of abuse, how men tend to follow in the steps of their dads, where they become the abusive partner,
Mm.
and then women, unfortunately, fall into their mother's steps, and they become the end receiving of the abuse.
Mm.
So it's like it's really hard to break that cycle at that point in time when parents still haven't found a way to communicate solely for the well-being of their children.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because a couple of things that you said, like if your experience, and a lot of times abuse is intergenerational, right? It continues. And if that's been your experience, like you said earlier, growing up, you're not gonna really recognize that there's signs of abuse in your relationship because as a child, you saw your parents do that to each other. And you're thinking, that played out here. So what's playing out here is just normal. That's what happens. And I think it's almost really requires like a radical shift in perspective for you to just be like, yeah, abuse is happening to me and it happened in my childhood. And I think that that is really hard and, something that people are, like I said, kind of reluctant to look into. But when people have recognized that there is abuse occurring in their relationship, they listen to this podcast or, find information. What's their next steps?
I advise to get in contact with a helpline, the National DV line, whether it's JBWS or whatever is in their vicinity, so they can safety plan. I think that's the most important step, safety planning, because believe it or not, what works for one person doesn't work for the next.
Mm.
Filing a restraining order could put you at more risk than not filing one. Leaving the home unexpectedly could put you at more risk. So I think it's safety planning, breaking it down to little pieces that you wouldn't think of normally to create a plan so that you can leave safely. And whether that's shelter placement, whether that's going to a family member, definitely if you have kids, probably not leaving the state
Mhm.
because that is considered kidnapping. If you leave the state without the agreement of the other parent, which in that situation would be very hard to get. So I think it all comes down to safety planning. That would be the first step. And then see what your options are and save as much money as you can because living on your own after probably being taken care of financially only is very hard to get back into the world.
Hmm. Wow. What you said about that being considered kidnapping is not something I knew. So that is actually really good information because I feel a lot of people have, out-of-state parents or whatever that they could go to and not even realize that that could be a legal violation. So I think that was
Hmm.
incredibly important. Thank you for sharing that. We have two final frequently asked questions about domestic violence. And the first one is, what is the difference between just a fight and domestic violence? You're getting into an argument with your partner versus an abusive situation.
That's a really good question. I think a fight doesn't escalate to the point where you're given the silent treatment. Someone might raise your hand at you. Someone might say very cruel things, not only because of the heat of the moment, but because they truly believe it and they want to hurt you.
Yeah.
Whereas a fight, it's a back and forth situation. It's two people involved, and you're just communicating, maybe not in the best way possible, but you can recognize when it's getting out of hand and you can walk away from it, wait to cool down, and then have an adult, mature conversation about what led to the fight in the beginning and try to get to the root cause. Whereas a DV situation, things are definitely going to get out of control one way or another.
Yeah, and I think that's hard too because some people are like, well, is it just a fight? Did they just lose their temper? Like, not really understanding. And I think it comes back to not really knowing that domestic violence is about power and control. And it's about, keeping somebody under your control. And that's
Mhm.
not a fight. Like a fight is like, you get a little heated, you cool down, whatever, you apologize. It's not to like systemically keep you in the relationship and feeling terrible about yourself.
Mhm.
Um, and then the last question that I think people come across a lot is, I'm a man. Can I be experiencing domestic violence?
100%. And I see it more and more. And I'm not happy to see it at the shelter, especially because I would love for it to be just empty, no one
Yeah,
being
me too.
abused. But I think it's important, because we're defeating the stigma that this doesn't happen to men or people who don't identify with either gender. I think it's also important to include those people in there. But yes, it definitely happens. What is the reason that someone might look at you and want to target you to abuse you? I don't know the answer. I've been thinking about it since I started working here, but I think it comes down to maybe low self-esteem. And with power and control, people will find a way to take advantage of you through love bombing and then like seeing you in a vulnerable position and taking advantage of that vulnerability as opposed to helping you bloom through that vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what you said is very important. Any person, no matter how they identify, no matter the type of their relationship, could experience abuse. And this is something, this taboo topic, I think also keeps people in relationships longer. Is like even like a polyamorous relationship, you might be
Hmm.
afraid to say like, oh, I'm experiencing abuse because this is like kind of awkward, or a gay relationship, or if you're, non-binary outside of the, cisgendered binary, that I think that can also complicate it. But so your message is basically like, no matter who you are or what type of relationship you are in, domestic violence could be happening and no one is kind of excluded from that. Is that correct?
Yes, it's just like addiction. It doesn't choose. There's this video that the first time I saw it was in college. Probably like the fifth time I saw it was during our 40-hour training. It's
Mhm.
about this woman who talks about how she was highly educated and then she met her partner. Slowly started isolating her, then moved her out of state, and then she wasn't working. He was taking care of all of the bills, and then the real physical violence happened. And I think just like it happened to her, it can happen to a man. It happened to a person who doesn't identify as either. It could happen to a gay person. It could happen to anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, really amazing and really important. And it's also important to know that like help is out there for, every single person. JBWS, we don't discriminate based on anything. Like if you're being abused, you can come and seek services and support if you're in Morris or Passaic County in New Jersey. But I think that that's just a really good message. And then if you have anything that you want people to know about domestic violence or the signs of abuse, do you have a message for them or something that you want to cover that we didn't already touch upon?
I think at the end of the day, truly in our hearts, we know when things aren't going the way they're supposed to. but it the process isn't linear. It's going to take some people more time than others to accept that it's happening to them. I think one of the most challenging times happens right after you accept it and you're taking the next steps to get out of that situation. And truthfully, it's going to get harder, but it's going to be worth it because there will be a breakthrough and you will be better than you were a year ago or 6 months ago. It's just going to take a little bit of time and effort.
Thank you, Danny, for coming on the podcast and sharing such important information about this topic. I firmly believe that the more we are able to talk about domestic violence, the more people we will be able to help. Please come back next time to learn more about all facets of abuse, because education is the first step in ending domestic violence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations about Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency that serves both Morris and Passaic County, New Jersey. If you would like a certain topic covered on the podcast, then please send an email to podcast@jbws.org. We are always striving to provide content that will be both educational and helpful to our listeners. But please note that this email is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or any access to services. If you live or work in either Morris or Passaic County, New Jersey, and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, then JBWS is here to help you. Please visit jbws.org/services to learn more about programs for support, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to a member of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you're listening to this podcast and recognize controlling or unhealthy behaviors in yourself, then JBWS can also help you to change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and teens who have used abusive or controlling behaviors. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn how you can stop the cycle of violence. If you don't live in either Passaic or Morris County, then please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Since domestic violence grows in silence, you are helping us break the stigma associated with domestic violence and supporting our efforts to unsilence those impacted by abuse. Please be sure to subscribe to Unsilenced, Real Conversations about Abuse wherever you get your podcasts, and follow JBWS on social media to get as many people talking about abuse as possible. Thank you so much for listening and helping us to break the silence around domestic violence.